This is Tom Kozlik, the head of Municipal Strategy and Credit at Hilltop Securities. And today we have Gabe Petek, who is the Legislative Analyst at the California Legislative Analyst Office. Gabe serves as the nonpartisan fiscal advisor to both houses of the California Legislature and oversees the preparation of fiscal and policy analysis of the state's budget and programs. He's also responsible for preparing impartial analysis of all initiatives and constitutional measures qualifying for the state's ballot. Before Gabe joined the Legislative Analyst Office in February of 2019, he worked at S&P as the sector head in the U.S. States Group. And that's where I initially met Gabe and where we worked together when I was at previous broker-dealers. So thank you for joining us, Gabe. We appreciate you coming to talk with us today.
Good. Thank you for having me, Tom. Nice to be with you.
And what's prompting this interview is a report that Gabe and Gabe's office just released titled A Framework for Allocating Federal Recovery Funds. And in this report, Gabe and his office reviewed, and or I should say, set out some guidelines that California lawmakers could and should consider as a result of the fact that the American Rescue Plan Act is set to disperse $350 billion to state and local governments. And California is going to get a significant chunk of that. And so what I wanted to start out talking about with Gabe is, I was wondering if you could briefly describe the California budget situation and how California's federal allocation fits into the budget picture, and really not just for this year, but for the next couple of years.
Yes, thank you, Tom. It's a good question because it really does set the table for this discussion. It's pretty well documented at this point that California's budget outlook has undergone a reversal of fortunes of sorts since last year, and even since November when we did our fiscal outlook. In November, we estimated that the state was entering the upcoming budget process for fiscal year 21-22 with a budget surplus of $26 billion. Then in January, the governor released his budget proposal, and we estimated that the governor's office began with an estimated surplus of about $15.5 billion. So while still large, it was different from our estimate, but the difference really wasn't so much about the underlying economy or even the revenues. Rather, we had different interpretations around the rules governing when a deposit is required to the state's rainy day fund, the budget stabilization account. And the governor's office also estimated higher caseloads in some of the state's health and human service programs. And then they also had higher estimated COVID-related costs. So those three factors are probably what caused them to have a smaller surplus estimate than our office. And after you account for those differences, our outlooks were pretty similar. Now, both offices, after this budget year, were projecting the emergence of a new structural deficit in the coming years. The deficits would begin at a couple of $2 billion. And then by the end of the forecast period in 2024-25, we were estimating somewhere in the range of 11 billion to 17 billion in annual deficits. But things have continued to change, and since January, collections have outpaced even the updated January revenue estimates for this current fiscal year. Just through March, we are now $16.8 billion higher than what we estimated revenues for this year would be in January. And so, we're working on our revised revenue forecast at this moment, so I don't have updated estimates to speak to at this time. But, the collections to date strongly suggest the possibility of a surplus. And in effect, if you think of the state's revenue trajectory on a graph, and you take it's as if the revenues are now at a higher intercept, right? They're at a higher point on the y-axis. The question is, where do we go from here? What's the slope from here? Are we going to kind of revert back? Is this truly a one-time situation, or are we going to continue to grow from this new higher level? And that is really the key to answering whether or not the structural deficit we talked about in November will still be present, or whether this recent trend in tax collections will suggest a new higher level of revenue going forward. And so basically, we're in a situation right now where the state has a large surplus of its own. We're trying to figure out if it's going to be ongoing into the subsequent years. And then we have this approximately $26 billion of state fiscal recovery funds coming in as a part of the American Rescue Plan, as you described. So that's our current situation, Tom.
So 26 billion is expected to come into California. Could you review or highlight the leading principles that you identify in your report that you believe lawmakers should be prioritizing when kind of mixing that 26 billion in with the time period that it can be used in?
Yes. We developed 3 guiding principles, we called them. One is sort of process related, and then the other 2 are a little bit more policy oriented. The process related one is the first kind of underpinning principle, and that is where we suggest that the legislature just take its time to define its goals and develop a plan with regard to these resources. The reason for that is that, first of all, this is a large, once in a generation type of influx of federal resources. As you said, also, the money doesn't have to be spent this year. We have until the end of 2024 to spend the money. And then third, there are some complicated interactions. There's this large state surplus potentially that I talked about, and there's another element. It appears that our state may be on the cusp of going over its constitutional appropriations limit. And then you have the federal fund limitations. So there's some complicated interactions with those, and we think that warrants just taking time to develop a strategy for how to allocate these resources. The other 2 principles are identify gaps. As you know, some of there have been certain parts of the economy that were overlooked or not eligible for federal resources in previous rounds. Specifically, certain types of local governments, even in the American Rescue Plan, special districts were not a type of local government that was specified as receiving aid. So that's the second principle. And then the third is maximize longer-term benefits to the extent possible. We think it's possible some of the caseloads in the state safety net programs will increase as the federal assistance phases out. And there's just an argument to be had that since we have the ability to spend this over time, it would be wise to try to allocate it over a longer period of time.
And the deadline, correct me if I'm wrong, is to use the funds is December 31st, 2024?
That's right, yes.
And how do you think, how is it that this next potential phase of infrastructure legislation that the president has been talking about, how do that could also be another, complicating factor. It could help support in some ways what it is that's happening in California. Have you worked that into your advice in any way, shape, or form? Meaning, the potential for some significant infrastructure funds coming in, that could also be another, revenue source that state lawmakers should be considering. Have you been factoring that in as well?
Well, we do our forecasting work based on current law, so nothing formally that we're working on at this time builds in an assumption about the federal package that's under discussion. But we're certainly tracking that closely, and that would be another pot of resources that the legislature would have to consider how best to allocate.
And if anything, it probably adds some weight to your first process-oriented guidance in, take some time, right? Because if that's not going to happen until the summer, end of the summer or the fall, it makes sense to take some time to figure out what's what.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly right.
It's interesting. So lawmakers by nature are probably going to try to maximize the short-term benefits over long-term benefits. Are there specific optimal short-term tactics they should be considering to kind of match that third guidance point of yours? Are there specific tactics that they should be considering?
Yes. Well, I guess the generalizable point around this is that we think they should think about not just the program areas they want to fund, but the implementation of the policy as well. Take, for example, the area of childcare. Now, with many schools and daycare centers still not back into normal operations, lining up childcare, we think, could be one of the challenges that workers face as they seek to return to work. In fact, there was a need for additional childcare even before the pandemic, but we think it's even more acute now. And in the 2019-20 budget, the state provided funding for childcare facilities, but then they left it a little bit ill-defined, and they had the state superintendent of public instruction. They directed that person to develop several of the details related to this program. Because of the time that wound up taking, those funds were rescinded last year in anticipation. Last spring when we thought there was going to be a major budget deficit, those funds were rescinded. So the point of this is just to say that in order to ensure that programs are, put in, benefiting from the funding quickly and effectively implemented, the legislature is going to have to think carefully about not just, what they want to fund, but how they fund it. Now, some of this involves providing funding for the ongoing services component of delivering these programs. And while the federal resources might be helpful with funding these resources in the near term, they are a one-time resource. So we would caution against using them for ongoing expenditures absent a plan for replacing that funding later. So these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about right now.
Okay. One of my key takeaways from your piece, and this is really more as I was thinking about this topic over the last couple of, not just days, but last couple of weeks, and as I've been seeing some of the other items and or proposals of how it is that some states and or cities would like to see their federal money spent. One of my key takeaways was the fact that you said that lawmakers should take their time. That was just something that I hadn't thought of that, and I hadn't really seen anyone else zero in on that, and I really like that. And I think that it's especially, as you've been describing, there are specific reasons of why it is that California should take their time, but I'd have to imagine that there's also specific reasons of why it is that other entities should be taking their time as well. They might not be the same things that are pushing and pulling what's happening in California. They're probably distinct. But what it is that I'm wondering is how much time, they have a couple years here, but how much time is it? Like, how is it months? Is it years? Should they be thinking about it a certain amount of money over a certain number of years? Like, how is it that they should be thinking about that dynamic?
We don't necessarily have a specific time frame in mind. I think what we mostly wanted to convey is that they should not feel compelled to allocate all of these resources as a part of this budget process that we're in right now, and which must be completed by June 15th, according to our state constitution. So we leave that a little open, and we have this the issue is the federal funds can only be spent in certain ways that generally related to the pandemic and supporting essential work and that sort of thing. Then you have, as I said, all signs pointing to this state surplus, potentially a substantial one. And then third, which is more specific to California, but if the state is up against its constitutional spending limit, then this severely restricts how the state surplus can be spent. So that's where these complexities come into play. Think of this example. If we are over the state appropriations limit, one constitutional remedy to that is to reduce taxes proactively as a way of bringing our tax revenue and our spending level down. However, as you know, Tom, the American Rescue Plan has a provision in it which puts restrictions on the state's leeway to reduce tax revenues. So this is just an example of the kind of interactions that they have to think through, and it's not the type of dynamic that they have to figure out before June 15th is our main point.
Okay. So you mentioned the allocation for California at $26 billion, and that seems like a lot of money. But there are also some pretty significant structural changes in a combination of the labor market, commuting. I'm going to ask about the transition back to work in a second, but there are pretty significant structural changes that seem to be happening. Is this going to be enough for California over the next couple of years? I mean, there was last Friday, there was a jobs number that came out that was a lot lower than what folks thought. The president and the Treasury Secretary were doing interviews talking about some of these changes. And one of the things that the president pointed out is that the reason why that American Rescue Plan money was going out to state and local governments was to help during this transition. So is it going to be enough for this transition?
It's a really good question, and I think that we just don't know yet what the permanent effects of how people will work post-pandemic. Whether or not it's enough, I think our working assumption is that there won't be additional rounds of fiscal stimulus coming from the federal government, putting aside the potential for the infrastructure funds that you mentioned. But for example, if we saw a substantial and permanent decline in commercial real estate values, in that case, the funding received to date might not be sufficient to offset the impact on local governments. But realistically, if it is a permanent shift, we wouldn't expect temporary federal assistance to be the panacea for that anyway. So we're going to have to figure this out over the longer term. And so at this point, we just don't know, but that's kind of that's how we're thinking about it at this time.
That leads into the final question that I wanted to ask. The final question that I wanted to ask you is if there is some specific strategy that state or even local government lawmakers can be considering to kind of dull the potential negative financial impact of this, I guess what we're all trying to figure out what this transition back to the office is going to look like. Is it going to be are we a year or two away from a, pre-COVID norm? Or is the norm going to be something that is something in between what the pre-COVID norm was and what it has been like for the past 12 or 14 months?
Yes, those are the kinds of discussions we're having, and that is, a good capture of the range of uncertainty that we're thinking about. To be specific, as you said, though, the American Rescue Plan does include a provision that the federal resources may be used to fund water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. So one thing we're thinking about is the possibility of allocating some of these resources to help build out the state's broadband capacity. And that's one thing that policymakers could consider that might be helpful on a going forward basis. And it's probably helpful in almost any kind of new arrangement that we are with after this, one of the things that we're also thinking about is that the virus might turn out to be with us more or less indefinitely if it becomes like a seasonal disease the way the flu is. And in that case, you could see where we have these periods where we have to kind of go back into social distancing for a period of time or something like that. And in that case,
work from home.
Yeah, exactly. And in that case, the the ability to devote some of these resources to building out our broadband infrastructure might be a good investment to consider.
Okay, that's a great point. Well, Gabe, thank you very much for your time today. I look forward to having you back so we can talk more about the evolving situation with what's happening in Washington and also the evolving situation with what's happening in California. So thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, Tom. Your commentary is always must read, and I appreciate the invitation to be with you today.
Thanks very much.